Chapter 9.
Exactly a week to the day from the arrival of the Cartwright, the steam winch hissed, and the thick cable rumbled onto the drum as the precious burden was lifted out of its underwater tomb. They crowded the rail, watching the derrick swing into position. Then the steel cable rose to the surface and became two giant loops with a glistening crystal block trapped between them. A triumphant shout went up from all hands when the box was gently lowered onto the deck. Everybody crowded around it, but Dr. Shaw waved them back. "Stand away. We've no idea what's inside there. It might even be hollow or filled with gas. It could explode from the pressure difference." At his warning, they retreated. But the cube did not explode. It rested quietly on the deck, water dripping down its silty sides, an occasional gleam of brilliance showing in the sunlight. Arrangements had already been made to place it in an oversized decompression chamber at the university's physics department. Opening the cube would be a painstaking procedure, and nothing must happen to the strange occupant of the crystal coffin. At the dock the next morning, the Cartwright unloaded its strange cargo into a moving van for the journey to the university. Jordan and Stan accompanied the doctor and two movers to the laboratory. A short time later, the box was eased into a decompression chamber. "We've been doing research here on deep-sea organisms," Dr. Shaw explained. "Marine biology and archaeology often overlap. Some of my own research has been done in partnership with Professor Kincaid, who heads the biology department. This chamber was built to handle marine life as large as a whale, if need be. I'm sure our sleeping friend will find it comfortable if he's in a state of suspended animation." Jordan glanced sharply at the doctor. "Suspended animation? Are you seriously suggesting that the thing in the box might really still be alive? Jody, not so long ago in Siberia they discovered a woolly mammoth completely frozen in ice. When they thawed it out, every hair was in perfect state of preservation. A mammoth, Jody. 20,000 years old. Of course, those big ancestors of the elephant were warm-blooded creatures, so it was dead. Our lizard man," though Dr. Shaw's voice trailed off, but a light danced in his eyes. "Think of it. A cold-blooded being, maybe even water-breathing, a missing link between mankind and the sea. From a civilization at least as advanced as our own." Jordan shook his head in wonder. The lizard man alive? It wasn't possible. Was it? The box now rested on the floor of the decompression chamber. The door was swung shut and locked. They could look inside through a large observation window. Dr. Shaw spun the valve handle and the pressure began to build slowly. When a simulated depth of 130 feet had been reached, he set the control to maintain this level. "Just to play it safe, until we open the coffin," he said. "When will that be?" Jordan asked. "This evening." The decompression tank door closed behind Jordan as he followed Stan and the doctor into the chamber. Professor Kincaid was already at work near the coffin-like box, with some unusual apparatus that had been wheeled inside the tank. "A portable laser," he explained. "Its beam ought to cut through just about anything." The laser resembled a television camera, with a long glass tube protruding from one end. Within a coiled segment Jordan could see a slender ruby rod, the heart of the powerful instrument. The laser would produce a thin beam of light capable of piercing steel plate, quartz, or even diamond in a matter of moments. And its selective focus would keep the beam from touching the inert body inside the crystal coffin. "No need to open the box underwater though," Stan told Jordan. "Professor Kincaid has already studied our lizard man through the little window and feels confident he's an air-breathing individual. No gills. Other physical evidence too, he tells me." Jordan frowned. "You guys talk like he's just taking a snooze or something. He's really been dead for 100 million years, hasn't he?" Professor Kincaid gave the boy a strange look. "Maybe," he finally said. The casual reply sent a thrill down Jordan's spine. He grinned at the professor and tried again. "You don't really think he's going to get up and walk out of that box when we open it, do you?" "Well," the older man began, "I've found out a few little things today and they may interest you. For one thing, I have located the seam on the box. Look here. He stooped under the coffin, which had been mounted on two steel horses. Jordan strained to see what he was pointing at. It was there, a dark hairline that ran the length of the base and then up each side. A moment later, Jordan also made out the fourth seam along the crystal surface. The entire side of the box must somehow swing outward to provide an entrance. And if you'll look beside the occupant's hand, you'll see a very small depression in the wall surface, Professor Kincaid continued. See? Right next to his thumb, if that's the correct name for it. Jordan took his turn glancing through the peephole and saw a faint circular mark by the hand of the lizard man. Jordan tried to study the creature's face, but the lighting was too dim for him to make out more than vague duplication of the features he had already seen on the statuette. It was a weird sensation to be a peeping Tom on a form of life that had vanished from the face of the earth eons before mankind had even crawled from the primordial slime. Professor Kincaid continued his lecture with obvious relish. Now, that little stud must be the release mechanism that opens the coffin. And does that suggest something to you, sure? You mean the box opens from inside? Precisely, sir. That was the intention. And that means our friend expected to return to life after a period of suspended animation. Professor Kincaid turned from one astonished face to the next and laughed in triumph. Gentlemen, that hermetically sealed mechanism must still be filled with some element, a gas perhaps, that has kept our lizard man in perfect condition since the moment he sealed himself inside. Dr. Shaw shook his head slowly. This is impossible, he finally muttered. Oh, come now, the professor chided. Is that the scientist speaking? Look at this magnificent casket, Shaw. Fashioned by an incredible civilization and from a form of synthetic diamond that must have been commonplace in their time. Well, Dr. Shaw conceded, his eyes shining, you're usually right. It looks as though we aren't going to examine a fossil after all, eh? The chance that this creature can be brought back to life is faint, but it's there, replied the professor. We'll have to make a small entry hole near the release stud and then activate it. Once the side opens, we'll have to be ready for just about anything. Once the gas escapes, then what? Stan asked. Will there be danger of the body disintegrating? Professor Kincaid shrugged. Who knows? I don't think it is likely. After all, he's not surrounded by liquid, so we may reasonably assume him to be an air-breathing organism. I think the best procedure would be to drill a small opening in the box, near the release stud, then attach a suction pump line over the hole and let whatever gas may be present drain off into a container, especially since we don't know what it is. We can reseal the hole afterward or go about opening the coffin. Suppose the change of atmospheric pressure crushes him? Stan demanded. Shouldn't we set the air density inside the box to what it was where we found him? We'll do that when the gas is removed, Professor Kincaid explained. We'll simply run the pressure line through the same opening. And observe our visitor's behavior before we release him, Dr. Shaw added. We might have to take additional steps to ensure his safety. And ours, Jordan muttered. The two scientists had a lengthy discussion on procedures. Nothing must be left to chance, Dr. Shaw argued. This is one baby we don't want to destroy. We're not likely to make a find like this again in 1,000 years. Or even another 100 million. Yes, we'll proceed with great delicacy. We must observe the condition of the body as the pressure inside the box changes. The laser was positioned, and its power lines connected. Be careful where you cut through, cautioned Dr. Shaw. We really don't know how that release stud works. The professor grunted. I'll break through a few inches above the stud, to play it safe. He turned on the laser. The narrow beam blazed against the crystalline surface as the scientist hunched forward, his face hidden behind a protective mask. The others stood well back. The seconds crawled by. This stuff's putting up a real fight, Professor Kincaid said. Never saw anything like it. A faint plume of vaporized diamond rose. A moment later there was a high-pitched whistle of escaping gas, and the old man quickly pulled back the laser. Dr. Shaw came forward with the nozzle of the rubber vacuum clamp and pushed it against the tiny hole. His massive arms struggled to hold it against the box. The pressure of the unseen gas was obviously far greater than they had expected, for the hose leading to an empty oxygen tank snaked across the floor, writhing wildly. The tank itself rocked for an instant until Stan took hold to steady it. "Will the cylinder hold it all?" Jordan shouted. "It better," Dr. Shaw replied as beads of perspiration coursed down his face. "We have the largest one in the lab." At last, the pressure ceased, and Stan locked the valve securely. Dr. Shaw removed the rubber clamp and quickly inserted a plug to seal the hole. "Now we've got a fairly good vacuum inside there," he said. "What are we going to do now, Kincaid?" "We'll pump a small quantity of pure oxygen into the coffin," the professor replied. "Can't be sure what atmospheric condition would be right. He's contemporary with a period of lush vegetation. We'll introduce a reasonable mixture of oxygen and nitrogen and see what happens." At his direction, Stan and Jordan wheeled forward the ready bank of cylinders and Professor Kincaid inserted a V-shaped glass rod into the two rubber hoses trailing from the tanks. To this he added another line which he thrust through the small opening in the coffin. Then, glancing at a sheet of computations, he turned the valves on each cylinder and the gases hissed into the translucent box. "That's enough," he muttered and withdrew the hose. He plugged the hole once more. "Now, let's wait and see." Jordan stared at the figure of the lizard man, dimly visible through the crystal walls, and felt his pulses throbbing. All the strange discoveries of the past several days swept over him in a sudden wave. He was about to ask something of Dr. Shaw when suddenly there was a tremendous explosion and bits of metal whirred all about the decompression chamber like shrapnel. The tank containing the strange gas had given way. Jordan dropped to the floor, the warning scream dying in his throat. He cowered, face down, not daring to move while the bits of metal still sang and ricocheted around the chamber. And then his eyes began to smart and fill with stinging tears. The gas. His senses dimmed and the metal walls spun crazily. Orange and red flashes blinded him. He heard someone cry out, then darkness poured over him. Dr. Shaw somehow made his way to the interior oxygen controls and clawed at them. Fighting to keep from blacking out, he pressed his face close to the oxygen outlet and breathed greedily. His eyes refused to focus for long moments, then he made out the forms of his companions slumped in grotesque postures. The sound of escaping oxygen grew louder, a dull booming in his ears. Blurrily, he looked toward the shattered tank, then collapsed. Hovering on the brink of consciousness, he fought grimly to clear his head. Slowly, the red curtain lifted, and he saw Jordan's inert body before him. Dr. Shaw crept on all fours toward the boy. He took hold of him by his collar and dragged him closer to the oxygen outlet. Then he pulled Stan and Professor Kincaid toward the revivifying gas. The three began to stir slightly. With a groan, Dr. Shaw slumped against the wall and gasped. Jordan slowly opened his eyes. When they could focus, he saw the doctor grinning crookedly at him. "My head feels like a balloon," Jordan whispered. Stan blinked at him and nodded. "I thought we'd had it," he finally said. "If Doc hadn't turned on the oxygen, we'd all be taking that big sleep along with our boy in the box." "What was it anyway?" Jordan asked. The professor shrugged and got to his feet. "We'll never know now." He stared at the coffin moodily. "An inert gas. But how could it remain inside all this time without somehow dissipating?" He shook his head. "Are we going to open it?" It was Dr. Shaw who voiced the question on all their minds. They gathered around the box again. The body of the lizard man lay there, vaguely visible, mocking them. "I suppose this is as good a time as any," Professor Kincaid said. "One thing bothers me, though. I can't figure out how this creature planned to return to life. He would have had to be conscious to press the catch and release the gas." "Maybe there's some kind of automatic control," Jordan suggested. "You know, like a time clock." "Can't see anything inside that looks like it," the professor replied. "More complex than that," said Dr. Shaw. "Perhaps a mechanism that triggered the process when conditions outside were suitable for reawakening." He shook his massive head. "Oh, for Pete's sake, let's quit stalling." Professor Kincaid sighed. "All right. Here we go." He reached out and removed the plug from the tiny hole. The slight whistling of escaping gases began again, then trailed off. Air pressure was now equalized. The coffin's atmospheric content was compatible with the air they were all breathing. The scientist again wheeled the laser forward and carefully enlarged the opening until it was large enough for him to reach through. He waited several moments, took a deep breath, and slid in his fingers. Reaching in, he pressed the stud. The giant cube instantly filled with an eerie, pale light. The group of onlookers drew back involuntarily. "Holy cow!" Jordan exclaimed. "Look at it." One side of the coffin had taken on a luminous, rainbow sheen and the colors danced erratically. Then, as they watched, the entire side quivered and slowly dissolved. The lizard man lay revealed for the first time. His pale skin was like tinted wax. Their eyes ran along his 9-foot length, motionless and yet suggesting arrested life. The silken mesh coverall that clung so tightly to his body, seemed like part of his skin. A thin, fleshy membrane stretched between his fingers and toes, yet this did not lessen his humanoid appearance. His eyes were closed, and the wide mouth was slightly parted to reveal fine rows of needled teeth. Through the translucent lids, they could see round, green orbs that bulged outward against the protective membrane covering them. "Just beautiful," breathed Dr. Shaw. He reached out and touched the motionless fingers of the giant figure. Professor Kincaid produced a stethoscope from his laboratory apron and placed it against the chest. He fumbled around momentarily. "It's either dead or just doesn't have a heart as we know it." He stepped back with a frown. "Well, anyway, it isn't going to disintegrate, or it would have done so by now. What are we going to do next?" Jordan asked. Professor Kincaid made no reply. He gently pried open one eyelid and studied the exposed pupil with a pocket flashlight. He touched it. No response. "Look." On the floor of the box, under his left hand. Dr. Shaw lifted the limp wrist and they saw that a fine wire ran from one finger to the slab on which the creature lay. "Must be some kind of sensor connection," he muttered. "It's adhered to the box with a strong cement, I guess." "Ah. Maybe that's the answer," replied the professor. "There's our activating mechanism, I'll wager. When outside conditions were correct, this must have been planned to trigger him to life. Then he'd press the stud and the gas would be evacuated." "A fair guess," the doctor agreed. "If you'll look closely, you'll notice the connection seems to be broken. That's probably why he never revived." "Well, we'd better start making X-ray studies," said Professor Kincaid. He examined the silent figure again. "Anyway, this confirms our preliminary finding. No gills. It was air breathing. And that settles one thing," said Dr. Shaw. "It was laid to rest in the cavern at a time when there was no water surrounding it. Probably before the cave itself was located beneath the ocean floor. It may be even older than we thought, living at a time when the coastal mountains and the cave were part of the same cliffside." Jordan stared at the creature and his mind reeled backward through time. He could almost see the boiling seas, the streams of bubbling lava hissing on some long-forgotten shore. And a shadowy city came into his thoughts as he gazed down on the quiet form. A city of creatures like this, intelligent beings with a knowledge of science that might have far surpassed anything mankind had accomplished in the recent few thousand years he had struggled up from the jungles. All gone, vanished without a trace except for this last surviving specimen. Or were there other members of this lost race existing somewhere beneath the deep reaches of the Atlantic? "We'll do an autopsy tomorrow," Dr. Shaw was saying. "Unless," he added, "there is some means of reviving him." Still shaken by their frightening experience, the group decided to lock up the laboratory for the night. They stepped out, secured the airtight door, and readjusted the atmosphere in the chamber to the richer mixture of oxygen and nitrogen that the lizard man must have breathed in his time. "I'll be over at 8 o'clock, Professor Kincaid advised them. The others climbed into Dr. Shaw's car and drove off.